and welcome to Off the Cuff with Suzanne and my very special guest over this way, Beth Brown-Reinsel. And we're going to have a conversation in just a few minutes, but first I want to say a few things. If you would like to ask a question, be sure to put it over in the chat and put the word question in all caps first, because that makes it easier for me to find. If you have a very, very specific question, like about one of Beth's patterns or her books or any of her written or recorded materials, if it's a specific where she would have to know the page number that you're talking about, it's probably best to ask her that via her website. So she has a chance to get to the book, open it up, and see exactly what you're talking about and give you the very best answer that she can. But other kinds of questions, general questions like what makes a gansey, and stuff like that are wonderful questions to go ahead and ask. So let's see who's on here so far. Eric Joseph from Belgium, Scott from San Francisco, Francoise from Lyon, France. Hello, Francoise. Vicky B. from Monterey, Dolise from Washington, Fatima from Portugal, Diane Eddy from Canada, Anne Tremoliers she's in the Burgundy area of France, Elizabeth Nielsen from Sweden, Luana Hendricks from Missouri. My mother was from Missouri, so I have a special place for that. Jolie from Atlanta, Nancy Creedmoor. Hi, Nancy. Nancy is a master knitter. Dolise, we already said. Susan Day from Newcastle, Washington. Susan McBride, Scottsdale, Arizona. Mary Inman from Atlanta. Vera Van Sleek. Vera, where are you from? Carol Brasino. Eric Joseph, he says, bonjour, Scott. And a whole bunch more people. Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see you here. I am extremely excited to welcome Beth. I'm pointing in the Beth over here, Beth, to my live stream today. Beth is someone that I've always looked up to, and what I really like about her is her focus on traditional knitting, because that's where I really enjoy is traditional knitting. And I feel like if you want to go off and be an adventurer in knitting, you have to have a firm foundation first. And that's what Beth does, is she teaches that traditional foundation. So hi, Beth. Nice to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yes. So I'm going to lead you off with what brought you to knitting in the beginning.
Okay. Well, I don't remember seeing someone knit for the first time, but I remember when I was 7 that I knew I had to find out how to knit. So I asked every woman I came across, like at church and everything. My mom didn't knit. So being a good mom, she asked around and found the lady on the corner was willing to teach me. So she taught me to knit and cast on and purl, and that was it. And it was in English style. And then 2 years later, a relative from Switzerland came and taught me continental. So I feel I was very fortunate to learn both styles very young. So as a child, I loved making things. So I learned to sew and weave and dye and spin and crochet and do baskets into my 20s. And then I wanted to open up a yarn shop with a couple friends. And this was in the early 80s. And so I was just knitting anything at that point. But having the shop made me realize that I had to offer classes to educate everybody so they'd want higher quality products that we had in the shop. And that's where I learned that I loved teaching knitting. And so we limped along in the shop for maybe 3 years. But when it closed, I went on to teach at the community college where I lived. And around then, I saw Michael Pearson's book, Traditional Knitting. And I when I first opened up that book and saw the illustrations of the underarm gussets and the neck treatments and the shoulder joints, this workshop popped into my head, my Gansey workshop. And so also around this time, I had heard of the Knitting Guild of America. So that's the old name, I know. So they had a national convention in 1987 in New Orleans. And so I went and I had a wonderful time. And I decided I wanted to teach there. So I developed my Gansey workshop well enough and taught it in 1989 at a regional conference in Baltimore. And then they asked me to go to Atlanta in 1990 to teach it. And after that, they asked me to develop a correspondence course for the Guild. And so I wasn't sure I could do that, but I said, okay. And I worked on it for 3 months. And when I was done, I realized, I think this could be a book. So with some encouragement from friends, I proposed it to Interweave, and they took it right away. I couldn't believe it. And so I thought, oh, this is going to be great. Well, before I heard that they were going to take my book for sure, I started the Master Knitting program. I felt I needed that for my confidence, and I did learn a lot. And so I got that. I passed the 3rd level in 1991. And so from 90 to 92, I worked on the book. It took 2 years, and it was really hard work. I love to write. I love to design, but when you do a book, you have to go into very specific detail all the time, and that's exhausting to me. Anyway, also my children were very young, so it made it quite difficult. I'm glad that's over. But I'll tell you that my book came out again in 2018. I revised and expanded it. And I thought it'd be a piece of cake this time because it's already written, right? Oh my gosh, it was so stressful. Maybe not quite as stressful as the first time, but it was still hard. But I'm very gratified that I had that opportunity to do that. So anyway, after my first book came out, people started calling, and I began teaching all over the country and in Canada, and eventually overseas as well. So it's been 30 years now that I've been teaching on a national level.
Wow. Yeah. So what are some of the more interesting places that you've taught?
Well, let's see. I love the Yukon and, Whitehorse. I've taught in China. I taught in China last year. That was an amazing experience. I was so gratified to have that opportunity. I taught at the National Silk Museum in Hangzhou. And I went to New Zealand in 2017 for 2 months. I spent 1 month teaching in the South Island and 1 month teaching in the North Island. So I've been on tours where I was teaching in Sweden. I was at Shetland Wool Week. Was that last year? I think it was the year before. So I'm just very lucky. And then, I get to go on cruises and teach. So I go all over. At the end of the month, I'm going to South America and Antarctica.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited.
I have a question from one person.
Sure.
This is from Chris Antonuk, and he says, "Hi, Beth. You have devoted your life to teaching traditional knitting to knitters around the world. Why is this so important to you and to us?"
Well, hi, Chris. Chris is from Maine, and she's a great knitter. She's a great artist. It's great to hear from you. So I think that traditional knitting really touched me because I realized, it made the connection for me with women from the past and men from the past who knitted. And it gave knitting more meaning. It wasn't just buying some yarn and making a sweater. It was passing on these wonderful ideas, motifs, patterns, construction techniques that had been used long ago. And I think it's so enriching to appreciate knitting from that point of view.
Yes, to me, when I knit, not always, but sometimes I'm just amazed that my hands are doing the same things that so many hands before me have done.
That's right. I know. I think about that too.
It's a continuum.
That's right.
It links me to all those people in the past and all the people in the future.
That's right. Exactly. Gives me goosebumps.
It does, me too. So Sue Mills is from New Zealand, and she says, I missed you in New Zealand. Please come again.
Oh, I would love to. Maybe in a couple years. I have my sights on it. I'd love to.
Well, I would like to go to New Zealand. Maybe we should go together.
That would be awesome.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, you have to let me know about a year in advance, though.
Yeah, that would be very fun.
Great. Yeah. Cool.
We could share some of the expenses.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty expensive to go, but it's worth it.
Okay. So now I know in some of your research that you've done that you've actually gone to museums and seen actual knitting artifacts.
That's right.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I've been to museums. I'm sorry, you froze for a moment. What was that?
Okay. I know you've been to seen actual knitting artifacts to study them.
Yes.
To learn more about traditional techniques. Can you talk a little bit about some of those experiences?
Yes. So in the 90s, I took my first research trip to Scandinavia, and I was really struck by how different each museum managed their artifacts. In Oslo, in Norway, I could not even touch anything, even with gloves. I had to just watch while they would hold something up and then put it aside and hold something else up. And I was like, whoa, I can't even, get the gauge or anything. It was so frustrating. And they were going to charge me so much money if I took any pictures. So that was a bummer. But then I went to Setesdal in Norway, and they let me use gloves. They let me take as many pictures as I wanted and didn't charge me. And so it's very different. I also went to Denmark and Sweden on that trip. And boy, at one museum, they just left me alone with all the stuff. I was really surprised. But it's so exciting to see these old pieces. One sweater I picked up, and an arm pad fell out that had been made from an older sweater of the same type, a natttrøye, which was such a surprise. Anyway, go ahead.
So, have you ever, this is something we have not talked about before, but Priscilla Gibson Roberts has that huge collection of traditional knitting. Have you ever seen her collection?
No. Well, I've seen a few pieces. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen her in a long, long time.
Right.
But I actually didn't know she had this huge collection.
She does. She didn't collect it herself. What she did was her husband was in the armed forces, and she has a really bad back, and so it's hard for her to travel. And she would ask the wives of his fellow officers when they were traveling overseas to get things for her. And so they would bring her back pieces that they would get at bazaars and things, from the traditional work. And so she has quite, do you remember when they had that first sock summit when Tina Newton and Stephanie Pearl McPhee put on the first sock summit?
I remember when that happened, yeah.
Priscilla was there, and she brought all of her knitting. She brought all of her stuff. She had it all laid out so we could see it. We couldn't touch it, but we could see it.
How wonderful.
It was awesome.
I didn't go to Sock Summit, so I'm sorry I missed that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I should have mentioned that her book, Knitting in the Old Way, was very pivotal for me, as well as Michael Pearson's book. And, of course, Knitting Without Tears by Elizabeth Zimmerman.
Right. So there you go. That's another question. So who has influenced you? Yeah. What are your influences?
There you go. Michael Pearson, Elizabeth, and Priscilla, Alice Starmore. I'm sure I'll think of more later, but those are the ones that come to mind right now.
What's interesting is when you go back, I'm going to put it on split screen again here. When you go back and you actually read those books, a lot of the things that people come out with now are already in those books.
Yeah.
Right. You know, it's like Priscilla Gibson Roberts is like she figured out intarsia in the round. It's in her book. Actually, it's in 2 of her books. She describes how to do that, you know. And everybody goes, how do you do intarsia in the round? You can't do intarsia in the round. Well, she figured it out, you know, and it's in there.
Yeah.
And there's another one by Priscilla Gibson Roberts I found. You have to look at her. You have to read the patterns. You have to read the stuff. And you find these little clues in there. Like she has a way to do a Kitchener bind-off on knit 2, purl 2 ribbing on one needle. You know what I mean? Like you do a tubular bind-off, only it's knit 2, purl 2.
Wow.
And you do it with a needle, just like tubular bind-off on knit 1, purl 1. But she has it, and it's in her pattern, the Bazaar socks. Those they're called Bazaar socks. It's just a little direction in the pattern, and it tells you how to do that. And I've never seen it anywhere else, you know. So to me, those people, it's worth reading all of their works, including yours. You're in that same subset.
Thank you. Thanks.
So now, what if people want to learn more about your teaching materials? How can they get teaching materials from you, or take classes from you, and talk about you said it's Patron, or how do you say that? It's
Patreon.
Patreon.
So that's a website where people can become patrons of different artists, and so this has been a real boon for me because I've taught so much, 3 and 4 weekends a month, and so I was literally packing and unpacking all the time. And there are books I wanted to finish and other projects I wanted to do in knitting. So this is enabling me to cut back on the travel so that I can get to these things. So it's pretty exciting. So you can just go to Patreon. I'm sure you have the link there. And you can choose a level that you'd like to support me with. And you don't have to do it forever. You know, I just appreciate whatever anyone can do. Also, one of my projects is to get my workshops up on teachable.com so that people who can't travel to take my classes can go there and download the lessons. I am trying to get video to go with them, and that's what's holding me up because it takes a lot of time, as you know, to do that kind of thing. But that's in the works. I hope everybody will check out craftcruises.com because I do a cruise every year. I just found out about my next cruise next year. I guess I can't really talk about it yet, but
darn.
But anyway, let's see. And check out my website because I have my workshop calendar there, and you can see where I'm going to be, what I'm going to be teaching, who to contact.
And people can download, they can stream things from your website, right? Like the DVDs that you have, they're streamable now?
Well, they can purchase them on my website and then download them or stream them. Them. Yes.
Right.
That's right.
So what kind of DVDs and things do you have? What kind of teaching materials do you have on your website?
Well, I have videos of just little techniques like strangling bobbles and sewing and cutting steeks and different cast-ons and things like that. Shoulder join from the Cowichan sweater. But the DVDs, this one is... Can you see that? It's available. This is the Sanker Glove DVD, and I don't have this on my website, but it's available through Interweave as a digital download. And these 2, ganseys and color knitting, those are the 2 that are you can get on my website.
Here's another question. This is from Vicky B. And she says, I'm curious if Beth knows the breed of sheep that may have been used in the traditional ganseys.
Well, I've been asked that numerous times. And the thing is that the Industrial Revolution, which essentially was based in textiles, had pretty much become very, what am I trying to say? It was already done. It was part of life then. So what I'm saying is that gansey yarn was manufactured. And I have never run across any reference to a particular type of breed. Sorry.
That kind of leads me into another question that someone asked in my Ravelry group, and that is, what makes a gansey a gansey?
Yes. So let's see. I happen to have one right here. Well, maybe I'll show the little one. So this is the little gansey of my one-day class, and usually there's a very substantial cast on so that the knitters didn't have to repair all the time. The underarm gusset, which is this diamond-shaped piece under the arm, that gave freedom of movement to the fishermen who wore them in the British Isles, and it made the garment last longer. And let's see, the saddles, the shoulder straps, lots of different gussets around the neck, knit pearl motifs. All of those are part of what makes it a gansey. But also it's knitted in the round up to the armholes, knitted flat from the armholes to the shoulder. The shoulders are joined, the sleeves are picked up and knit down to the cuff, and then the neck is finished. So it was made from worsted spun yarns, which are very hardy, and they'd last a long time. Really beautiful in their simplicity.
And often they have a design in the upper portion and they're plain in the lower portion.
That's correct.
And yes, that's because they wear out the lower portion faster, right?
I would say so.
Yeah. So it's easier to repair that if there's no design.
Correct.
And the sleeves being knit down, that's so they can easily replace the lower sleeves when they wear out.
That's correct. Yeah.
So what is the difference between a gansey and a jersey?
Well, there's controversy about that. And from my perspective, I'd say that jerseys are stockinette stitch. They probably don't have the underarm gusset, but they possibly are made in the same way, circularly and then flat and then picked up and knit down.
Yeah, and I have, that Gladys Thompson. This book. Oops, let me put me on here so people can see. Both screens. Okay, this book here.
Wow.
And somewhere in here, and most of the time I can't find it, but I know I read in here, because it's about jerseys, Guernseys and jerseys, and not ganseys, Guernseys.
Okay.
And she talks about them being knitted all the way up to the top and then steeking, but you don't make bridge stitches. You just you reinforce by sewing and cut the opening for the sleeve.
Right. Well, the old ganseys and Guernseys weren't done that way.
Right. They were knit flat in the upper part.
Right. Yeah.
And then I'm going to ask you some more questions kind of like that. So there's ganseys and then there's fisherman sweaters.
Okay. So when we think of a fisherman sweater, usually what comes to mind is an Aran. Lots of cables and creamy white and all that. So really, the gansey predates the Aran by 100 years.
Right.
And the Aran was made of woolen spun yarn and usually undyed, and it actually was developed in the earlier 1900s for the tourist trade.
Right. Yeah, it's not new. It's not new.
It's not real old.
Yeah.
So, but that's okay. I love what Richard Rutt said in his book, The History of Hand Knitting. He said, just because it's not old doesn't mean it isn't
good,
amazing and worth our attention.
right?
So it's
So another difference is in the ganseys. They're knit fairly tight, right?
yes, 7 or more stitches to the inch.
Because they need to be like windproof and waterproof, and
somewhat, yeah.
They're right. More rugged.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas
I mean, think of all those bobbles and stuff. You wouldn't want to be getting your fishing hook caught in that, right?
Right. So they were a work shirt.
The ganseys were, yes.
A gansey was a work shirt, and then like the Aran sweaters or the fisherman sweaters, they were more dressy.
Yes.
You wouldn't wear those to work in.
I would not be fishing in a white sweater.
Okay, so Vicky B has another question.
Mm-hmm.
Let me put it over here. I'm able to put these on the bottom of the screen here so everybody can see the question. She
nice.
says, in her book, Beth says that the traditional yarn can be a joy and a challenge and difficult for some folks to knit with and maintain gauge. I'm wondering what she means by that.
Okay.
Difficult and a joy and a challenge.
Well, when I'm working with gansey yarn, I just love how the definition of the stitches comes forward. But I have taught workshops where I ask people to do their swatches before they came in, and a lot of people are not able to get 7 stitches to the inch on that yarn because it's a hard yarn. It doesn't collapse. And so that is a problem for some people. Now,
it's not soft like merino wool.
No. And you wouldn't want it to be because that wouldn't hold up for however many years. Right.
Okay, let's see. Let me look through here. A lot of people say, like Deb Rohrbach says, she has the Color Stranded Knitting Techniques DVD, and it is great. Clear instructions.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
There's lots of other compliments on here, like this. Let me go over to my list. So are you going to be teaching at any upcoming retreats that people can go to? Do you have anything lined up?
Well, my 3 Vermont retreats that I hold every year, I'll be doing them this year. One is in May, and I'll be teaching an Estonian technique, ruusitud. In September, I'm teaching the one-day gansey and also Latvian fingerless mitts. And then in November, I'm going to be teaching, what am I teaching? Oh, yes, the Finnish korsnas techniques. And this is a beautiful sweater that incorporates crochet as well as knitting. We'll be making a little project bag for that. But also I'll be teaching at Stitches probably and different shops around the country.
So Chris, your friend Chris, has a couple more questions. This one is, what are the advantages of twined knitting over other types?
Such a good question. So twine knitting is about 400 years old. It's a technique that comes from Sweden, and it's called tvåanstickning in Swedish, and that means two-end knitting. So literally, you're using both ends of the ball to create the stitches. So one yarn will make one stitch, and the other yarn will make the next stitch. So you're constantly twining the yarns to make the structure. So it's thicker and it's warmer. It's going to last longer. It's stronger. And those are the advantages. Plus, you get motifs you can't get any other way.
Right. Beautiful. So, and it's less elastic.
Yes, that's true. It is.
It's a firmer fabric. She has a second question here. I get it. She says, can you comment on the debate, this is a tricky one, regarding dominant color knitting? Some famous designers feel there is no need to use special techniques to emphasize a dominant color.
That's right. I know of a few.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't bring my socks out here to show you, but I certainly have discovered, I discovered dominance a long time ago when I didn't know what I was doing. And it has to do with working with at least two colors, if not more, within a round or row. And I made a little sweater for my son, and halfway up, I inadvertently switched the yarns, and I couldn't figure out why it looked so different. So I've spent a lot of time figuring this out. The yarn that travels underneath the other as you're stranding along is the one that's actually going to create a longer stitch in your knitting. It's just a little bit longer, but enough so that it's going to show up more in the knitting. And so it appears dominant, more dominant in the fabric. So it's okay if you don't want to worry about that. It just depends on what you want to do with your knitting.
Right. And there's some people, maybe the same people that don't worry about color dominance, who catch their second yarn after every stitch,
Yeah.
And that's not really stranded knitting, in my opinion.
Right.
It's kind of like a combination between stranded knitting and twined knitting almost,
Yeah, I would agree with you.
It's a hybrid. And if you do catch them, and if you twist it at the same time that you're catching every stitch, then you don't have to worry about color dominance. But that's not really stranded knitting. You're not stranding anything.
Yes,
so,
I agree.
I like the stranded knitting technique, and I enjoy maintaining color dominance and using it to my advantage and not just letting it go willy-nilly.
Right.
Okay, so now Margot has another question. She says, Margot's one of my friends here locally, and Margot is a very fastidious knitter. Her knitting is excellent.
Wow.
But she's one of those people that needs to put a lot of money in the money jar because she thinks she can't knit. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And her question is, what level of knitter does one need to be to knit one of Beth's patterns?
Oh, well, it depends. I do design some for advanced beginners, but I would say that intermediate to advanced is the level that I usually design for. And my patterns are teaching patterns. I put lots of photographs in. I explain different techniques. It's not just a pattern.
The person is learning traditional knitting, and the pattern that you have created is the vehicle for them to learn the traditional knitting.
Well said. Thank you.
So Deborah Cisnero has a question. She says, I missed what is traditional yarn. She missed that.
Okay, traditional yarn would be a yarn that was typically used in earlier times, let's say the 1800s. So worsted spun yarn, where the fibers are aligned and then the yarn is spun parallel. That was the main yarn for many, many, many years, but it's a more expensive yarn to produce, and so we've gotten used to softer yarns, woolen spun yarns. So, but woolen spun has its own place too, for sure. It's warmer. So like, for instance, twined knitting yarns, they are 2-ply and they're very flat, just like Fair Isle yarns from Shetland. They're 2-ply and they're not for, big bulbous cables. They're for flat surfaces so you can see the color.
Right. So worsted spun yarn, the word worsted is not related to the word worsted weight yarn.
Correct.
There's no relationship. And some people haven't gotten that yet. Yes. But worsted spun yarn means typically that the fibers have been combed and
Yes.
lined up together, so all the fibers are going in the same direction. And then when it's spun, it squeezes out all the air. And it makes a very tight spin, and it doesn't pill as easily, and it's more durable. It's not as warm as woolen yarn.
Correct, because it doesn't have air spaces like woolen yarn does.
Right, but so then woolen spun yarn is typically carded and turned into what's called rologs. And then the rologs are spun, and it's not spun so tightly, so it has lots and lots of air. And those yarns are typically used for stranded knitting because they felt together, they stick together, and they're very, very warm, although they're very light. So there's a couple more questions.
Okay.
Chris likes to ask questions. Chris says, does Beth have a favorite ethnic knitting?
Oh, that's always the hardest. It's like, which kid is your favorite? I love stranded knitting and twine knitting probably the most. That's as good as I can get.
Now, there's a new book out on traditional knitting. I probably don't have it at my fingertips. Danish tradition. It's by Vivian Hawksbro. Have you seen it?
Oh, I have it. Yeah,
I love that book.
She took me to the museum where they housed the natroyer for her that she used for the book, and I got to take my horrible of these beautiful sweaters, and they were magnificent. I'm so glad I got to see them up close.
So some of those, though, they have the design in the over the upper sweater and plain in the below. So they have some of the characteristics of a gansey.
Yes, they even have welts that overlap down at the bottom. So, and they have half gussets rather than full gussets under the arms. So they are similar.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Okay. Jolie Knits says, are there ways to mitigate color dominance? For example, can you knit with one color at a time and slip the non-worked stitches, thus making multiple passes on each round?
I don't think that that's going to do it, because ultimately one yarn will be below and one yarn will be above, whether you're doing one at a time or both in the same pass.
And it's more of a visual thing. It's because the V's of one color sit slightly higher than the V's of the other color. And so visually your eyes make one seem a little bit larger. They're microscopically larger. They are larger, but it's so small that when you actually look at stitch by stitch, you can't see it. But when you step back and you see the effect that it has on color, and many times this has happened to me, and I know it's happened to everybody else too when they first start stranding, when you're not aware of color dominance. You're merrily knitting along, and then you finish your object and you block it, and then you see these stripes.
Yes, right.
And you go, and you didn't see those before. You know, you didn't notice them till it was completely finished. And then you're going, oh my God, that's color dominance or misdominance.
Yes, that's right. Yes. Okay.
Now, here's Chris again. She's so good. I'd like to meet her maybe. She says, if Beth were going to have a relaxing night of knitting, what sort of knitting would she do?
Oh, it would be a mitten for sure. I love knitting mittens. I love working on double points. And it would either be a twined mitten or a stranded mitten.
Okay, good answer, good answer. Now this is from Amber Shiwi. And she says, in Cowichan knitting, how is the switching of colors done? Isn't it one of the examples of trapping every second stitch?
Yes, it is. They traditionally weave or catch the yarn every other stitch. So in that instance, there really isn't, you can't say, oh, this color is dominant and this color is non-dominant, because they're being mixed up the whole time. So it makes it very thick and heavy. It'll be durable. That's just how they do it. And they mix up stranding and intarsia sometimes.
Right, and they use a much heavier yarn though, right?
It's much thicker, but the traditional yarn was pretty lofty.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't necessarily heavy, although...
Right. I mean, but larger stitches. It's larger stitches.
3 stitches to the inch,
so
maybe.
That's why they're trapping so frequently. Don't you think?
Yeah, I guess so. I don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to be doing some research about it this summer.
Cool.
And I will ask.
So there's another question. This one is from Fatima. Fatima lives in Portugal. She says, can be accepted knitting the garments from the book Knitting Gansey with home dyeing yarn. Is that acceptable?
I think whatever you want to do is acceptable. You are the master of your own knitting. And if you want to use hand-dyed or acrylic or whatever, I might not choose those things, but I think everybody needs to do what's fun and pleasurable for them.
And that's what Anna Zilberg says in her book, you are in charge of your knitting.
That's right. Forget the knitting police.
Yeah, and it's like, also, you know how you buy like a Zauber ball with all these colors in it, and sometimes there's a color I don't like, or I don't like 2 of the colors next to each other. Do you know what I do? I cut them out.
Oh, good for you.
I rearrange it. It's okay. It's my ball of yarn. I can cut it if I want to.
That's awesome.
Okay. Judith Lausch says, any tips for stranding looser to prevent puckering?
Absolutely. Especially if you're on double points, turn that thing inside out. The outside circumference of a sock or a mitten is bigger than the inside circumference. So if you turn it inside out and strand on the outside, then it just naturally occurs that you're going to strand a little more loosely, and you're still knitting in the same direction, and you're still facing the right side of the work. It's just inside the circle. A lot of my students have really found that to be helpful.
And also, I think sometimes people, when they first start doing stranding, they hold the yarn with the same tension that they do for regular stockinette stitch. And in stranded knitting, you have to allow space. You can't pull the yarn tight from stitch to stitch, because that's what makes the puckering.
That's right.
Yeah.
And one more thing I do is I stretch my knitting often. Yes. And that tells you what's going on and if you need to tighten up or loosen.
Okay, this is just a comment from David Hensley. He's at Disney Animal Kingdom watching us from there. And he says it's too loud to listen. He's going to have to watch us later.
Okay.
But he just wants us to know that he's here.
Well, thanks for letting us know.
Okay, this is from Chris again. She really has good questions. Is there an ethnic technique that you haven't tackled yet that you would like to learn?
I'm sure there are some that I don't know about yet, but one that I do know about, and I tried it once and I am not good at it, and that is the Rovaniemi technique, where, and it's from Finland, where you have several different balls of yarn making the design, and they're all on a knitting needle held above your work. And so you have to just use that for a couple stitches, and then you use another one for a couple stitches. And it's so hard to get that technique, the tension right. So that's one that I need to work on. Yeah. So
Amber Shiwi says, so are Cowichan, or am I saying that incorrectly? It's Cowichan and American knitting very similar?
Yeah. The Coast Salish people who knit the Cowichan sweaters knit English style. So it's pretty much the same as most of us.
So the Cowichan area, isn't that like the west coast of North America, the upper North America?
It's Vancouver Island specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, West Coast.
So Vancouver Island, just the island.
Yeah, it's a big island.
Yeah, it is a big island.
Yeah.
And those are really warm sweaters.
They are. Yes, they sure are.
Okay, does anybody else have any other questions? Think about it. We'll talk here for a few more minutes. And we have been going for 45 minutes now. We can fill up another 15 if people have some questions. Verona says, question, how do I post a comment? You just did, and you can do it exactly like that. Just put your comment on there, and I'll pick it up and answer it.
Okay.
So let's see. Did you talk about, do you have any, any Stitches conferences coming up, or did we talk about that? Are you teaching at any Stitches?
I'm teaching at Stitches United, Hartford. Is that April, I think? And I don't know about the others yet. I can never keep my schedule in my head.
That's hard. Do you do the Dallas-Fort Worth conference?
I haven't done that in a lot of years. I'd like to go back sometime.
They're starting to pick up again, I think. So Frank B says, question, I enjoyed your course on Latvian cuffs a few years ago in St. Thomas, Ontario. Are you coming back to Southern Ontario to teach another course?
Whenever I get invited, I'll be there.
He also says, I am very happy to support you on Patreon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I love to go to Canada to teach, so I hope, but I have to be invited. So
now the Amber's question, I misread it. She was the one that asked the difference between Cowichan and American. She actually meant Armenian. Cowichan and Armenian.
Oh, okay.
Are they similar or different?
Well, I guess they're similar in that they both, you have to catch the yarn every other stitch. But in terms of the yarn, the construction, the motifs, they're different.
Okay. Jolie, who asked a question before, she would like to know, who are the knitters in the pictures behind you?
Oh, these are wonderful. Can I go up a little bit? When I wrote my first book, I wrote to the Royal Institution of Cornwall because they had photographs that I wanted in the book, and they sent them to me and didn't need them back.
Wow.
So children from Cornwall who knitted for pay.
Wow.
Didn't get paid too much.
No.
Thanks for asking.
Okay, this is from Sue Mills, and she lives in New Zealand. She's asked a question before.
Yes.
Have you knitted Icelandic sweaters? How does that wool and technique differ from your other styles of knitting?
Yes, in fact, that's my newest workshop here. And I love the lopapeza. I love the yarn. I've used the unspun plotalopi. I've also used letlopi. It comes in so many different types. And it's got the circular yoke. So it is somewhat of a different construction. You can either knit from the bottom up or the top down. And am I answering the question?
Yes, you're doing fine.
Okay. So it's stranded, but only in certain parts. And it's a relatively recent development. I think it from the 50s, 1950s, maybe a little earlier. But they're a lot of fun to do. So
I have put all of Beth's contact information in the description below this video once it is recorded onto Facebook. Right now you can't see it, but you should all be able to come back to the video and review it anytime you want. And also there will be timestamps added tomorrow. Diana Danko always watches the video and creates timestamps so people can go to the specific location in the video that they'd like to watch over and over and over.
That's
And
great.
so in that same area, I have all of Beth's contact links, like her webpage, her Patreon. I don't know
Yeah.
how to say that. It's and
Yeah.
and
Weird. I know.
if you feel so inclined to support Beth, please do, because Beth is one of the people that is maintaining the skills of traditional knitting and passing it on to newer knitters. And this is how knitting gets passed down through generations. And this is my area that I really enjoy the most too, is the traditional knitting. And once you learn traditional knitting, then you can go off and do whatever you want to do, and you can combine it. You can
Yes,
combine it with any other type of knitting, but then you have a foundation.
that's right. It enhances modern knitting to know the old way, for
Yes,
sure.
exactly. And it just gives you that feeling that you're connecting with all those prior knitters.
I know.
And that, like you said, it gives you goosebumps. It gives me goosebumps too, it's like reaching back through time, you
Right.
know.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
all of Beth's websites down in that information, you can, there's a link to it. There's also links to her Facebook
Uh-huh.
and Ravelry and everything that you need to find her. If you have specific questions about patterns that she's written or her books, like a line by line question, just contact her from her webpage and she'll be able to answer that.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, that gave people to ask more questions. Let's see. Oh, Margot wants to know if Beth will show us more of her knitting.
Sure. I have a
Yeah,
pile of
okay.
here.
Let's look at that.
So I'll show you some, I love Sanker gloves. And I was lucky enough to go to Scotland in 2017 to Sanker and do some research there. I met May McCormick, who is the very famous Sanker glove knitter. And that was so exciting to meet her. Let's see. Here's one of my Lusekofte from Norway. Well, I mean, I knitted it. Can you see that?
That's beautiful. Gorgeous.
And so let's see. And then here's the little sweater that I developed for my workshop.
Isn't that cute? Look at that. It's darling.
And then in Sweden, I first studied the North Holland red and black pullover.
Wow.
And this is the little sweater for my class.
So these little sweaters that Beth is showing that go with the big sweater, she teaches all of these classes. And when you take the class, you make those little sweaters.
Yes. So
those
then you're learning the techniques in context.
Right. So you make a little mini sweater that has all of the techniques that you would need to make the big sweater.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that fun? Those are so cute.
Great. So let's see. Did I show this one?
No, that's beautiful.
And here's the little one.
Really nice.
And let's see. Oh yeah. Well, a gansey.
Mm-hmm.
And you had asked about that funny.
Yes, the green sweater, or whatever color it was.
What's this one?
Yes.
So just to reinforce the fact that I'm not perfect. Nobody is. And sometimes things go strange and and in this particular case, I don't have an answer for it. This sweater has 2 lines of cables down the front and down the back, and they're fine except for, I don't know, can you see that okay? See how the one cable is kind of poofing out weird.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is. And if anybody knows, please tell me. But I didn't make a mistake. It's almost the tension is off. I don't know.
It's I tried. I remember when you first had that problem, and Charles and I were both trying to replicate it,
Yeah.
It's a conundrum. It's a
It is
conundrum.
truly.
So everybody says they're loving the sweaters. Now, Margot says, what's the opening of the sweaters called? And I don't know what opening she's talking about.
Opening. I don't.
There's a neck opening, but maybe she means on the sides.
Oh, well, I'd call it a split welt.
Split welt.
Like this one has a split welt. So you have two welts and you overlap them.
Right. So they don't flap open. Now, Fatima has a question from the book Knitting Gansey. Which project do you consider more difficult to knit?
I think that Grace's cardigan is probably the most difficult because it's such a huge chart and it's been, you have to read it this way and then that way and then hop over and read this and that way. It's a difficult chart, but that was because of the space that I had to work with.
Right. So Margot has another question. The opening she was talking about is in the front where the clasp is.
Oh, like in this?
Yeah.
I call it a slit. I don't know another name for it, the front slit. Is that what she
maybe.
meant?
And
Yeah.
then she says also, can I modify your glove patterns to not include the fingers?
Of course. You can do whatever you want. My pattern is just a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. So, Chris wants you to angle your camera down a little bit.
Okay.
There you go. I think she wants to see sweaters.
Oh, yeah.
On the back of the couch. Oh, Deborah Cisneros says maybe she's referring to the placard. The placard at the front.
Placard. Oh, this one?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
Oh, so this, let's look at this one. So in the lusekofta from Setesdal in Norway, they knit this thing as a tube, and then they cut it and they've constructed this fabric from so that it comes in around the cut area, and then it's hand sewn down. Some people embroider it before they put it on, and some people embroider it after it's been applied. But it just covers up the raw edge and makes it easier to put on.
And that's not a knit fabric, is it?
No, it's woven.
Yes. So it's added on to the sweater.
Wool flannel would be
nice. Nice.
Yeah.
So let's see if I think we've got everything here. So I think you did really good, and I really appreciate your being on here and sharing your knitting.
Well, thank you so much for asking me. I really appreciate it.
So I want everybody, you need to go to her links that I put on once this is over. Be sure to check the links out. Be sure to check the Patreon. I'll never ever be able to say that right. You know, when I was a little kid, I called my eyebrows, I called them brow eyes. And I think I called them brow eyes until I was like in high school. So sometimes something gets stuck in your brain and you just can't get it out. But anyway, that was so fun, Beth. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And everybody, hope I see you in a class sometime.
Exactly. And I'll tell you, Beth is the very best teacher. She is so patient and kind and knowledgeable and also humble. Very humble. Thank you. We're going to say goodbye now. And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.